Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Welcome back inside the Alex Garrett Podcast Network. It's been a busy weekend, as you probably saw on my Instagram, AlexGNYC1. Yes, we are announcing an engagement all weekend long, and it's been exciting. But my eye is not turned away from Israel, and I feel like, based on the moves behind the scenes from this Biden administration, they have turned their eye off Israel in the sense of, and maybe my next guest, Bryan Riley, the director of the National Taxpayer Union's Free Trade Initiative, can weigh in here. Welcome, Bryan, by the way.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Maybe you can weigh on this before we start. Did you know the ambassador to Israel, the Biden administration selected, actually crafted the Iran deal, Jack Lew? I mean, I don't understand how they could be for Israel, yet try and get the guy who wanted the deal to happen and crafted the deal, the Iran deal, as ambassador. It doesn't make sense to me.
That doesn't. There are a lot of things that don't make sense with this administration, but that's certainly one of them. I'm no foreign policy expert. I don't pretend to be, but that's shocking to hear.
And so I want to get that off the chest, because what you're dealing with is dealing with some taxpayer issues, which is we are still sanctioning Israel even throughout this war. What's going on there?
Right. Well, so the long story, back in 1962, Congress passed a law which allowed the executive branch to restrict imports that it finds impair U.S. national security. So skip ahead to the Trump administration, which was concerned about low steel prices, particularly caused by Chinese economic activity driving down prices. So they put tariffs on imports of steel from China, but not just from China, but from most of our major trading partners, including Israel. In many cases, those tariffs have been removed or reduced, so they're not applied to Canada, they're not applied to Mexico. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the Biden administration suspended the tariffs on steel from Ukraine, but we've continued to apply the tariffs to Israel, 25% on imported steel and 10% on imported aluminum. At the time, two members of Congress asked President Trump to exempt Israel from the tariffs. They suggested that Israel is not a threat to U.S. national security. But the tariffs remained in place. The Biden administration has kept many of the Trump tariffs in place or tweaked them around the edges. But that goes for the tariffs on steel and aluminum from Israel, which at the current time it seems just almost unbelievable to me that we're imposing a form of economic sanction on one of our allies, particularly given the current events in the Middle East. So NTU today, we released a statement asking the Biden administration to remove those tariffs. The imports of steel and aluminum from Israel are not a threat to the U.S. in any way, shape, or form. Dropping those tariffs is not going to turn around the situation in the Middle East, but I think it would be the right thing to do and a sign of support.
All right, maybe there's a little in the weeds for people, but when we say import tariffs, I mean, break it down. So how much are the tariffs, and does this decimate Israel's economy while they're dealing with this war?
Well, at the time, a representative of Israel's manufacturing industry called the tariffs a death blow. But to be clear, Israel is not a huge exporter of steel and aluminum. So it's I think really more symbolic than anything. It's not as if we're putting an embargo on energy exports from the U.S. to Israel, where the tariffs that are affecting imports from Israel to the U.S. apply to many other countries as well. We've exempted them from Europe temporarily. They might go back into place. But a tariff is just a tax. So to be clear, we're talking about taxing imports of steel and aluminum from Israel. To the U.S., Israel is a very small supplier of steel. To Israel, the U.S. is an important export market. And it's just a signal, not just with respect to steel and aluminum, which face those taxes, but to the economy as a whole that can they rely on U.S. On the ability to access the U.S. market in the future. So it would really be at a minimum a sign of goodwill. It would help their economy. As I said, it's not going to turn anything around overnight. But there's absolutely no reason to leave those tariffs in place, even aside from the recent events. But certainly now, at all times, we need to get rid of the tariffs. We need to do what we can to be supportive. And this is something that won't cost the U.S. a dime, by the way. We're just reducing and removing a tax that specifically affects those imports from Israel.
All right. On the free trade front, I want to ask you, between the Biden and Trump administration, it seemed like Trump was trying to get deals done, trade deals done. He had a lot of different things going for him in that regard. And the Biden administration has really tossed out a lot of those free trade initiatives, hasn't he?
Well, the Biden administration, I have to agree with you, unfortunately, has really sidelined any trade talks. The Trump administration pursued the U.S., Mexico, Canada, the so-called USMCA agreement. I disagree with some of their tariff actions, but some in the administration made the case that, hey, we're just doing this to try and leverage more trade and to get better trade deals. The Biden administration isn't even trying, and the U.S. Trade Representative and head of economic policy for the White House have both said we're not pursuing market access in our trade talks, meaning we're not trying to open new markets for Americans. If you're a farmer, if you're a rancher, if you export manufactured goods, there's only so much we can buy in the United States. We need access to those foreign markets, and I guarantee you that countries around the world are cutting trade deals to try and expand their access to foreign markets while we're on the sidelines. And once we lose access to a foreign country, when somebody else gets in, it's really tough to regain our foothold. So it's bad in the short term, but really even more harmful in the long term. And particularly if you're a farmer or a rancher, for example, the ability to sell your goods to foreign markets is much more important than the Farm Bill and all the farm subsidies that we give to agriculture producers. They're relatively tiny compared to the ability to export goods to other markets. And the Biden administration has made that, not just made it a non-priority, but has explicitly said we're not interested in pursuing traditional market access agreements that we've had in the past. And so that means if you're an American businessman or exporter, you're really stuck in quicksand.
I wanted to, because we've covered this on the radio side of things, the idea that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, speaking of farming, is now kicking out Chinese, companies that want to buy the farmland. I mean, that's an issue. And is that a free trade issue as well?
Well, some would say that it is. I think if you look at the total amount of foreign purchases of U.S. farmland, it's pretty small. And if you look at Chinese purchases of U.S. farmland, it's even smaller. So I would prefer to see us focus on legitimate and real national security threats. If China or a hostile country is buying land next to a military base, clearly let's look at that. But I also believe, as an American, we have strong property rights, and if you own property, if you own land, you ought to be able to sell it to whoever you want to without the government getting in the way, unless there's a pretty darn good reason to prevent those foreign purchases. So yes, by all means, let's screen those for security purposes and make sure that there's no risk involved or no threat to U.S. security. But a blanket outright ban, I think, is an overreaction. It sounds to me more like politicians trying to get headlines than actually doing anything to confront some of the very real problems that we have with respect to some countries that don't have our best interests at heart.
All right, I want to ask you this because I felt like the Trump administration really utilized the trade agreements as leverage to keep our enemies intact, even in the China world too. The way he had those trade agreements with China. I don't feel like Biden's leveraging any trade, right now to keep our enemies at bay. Do you?
It doesn't seem like they are viewing that as a tool. They actually say we have to use every tool in our toolbox. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, if it's a soundbite or what the case may be. I do know that one of the best ways, in my opinion, to counter China is to expand trade with other countries, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Latin America, to strengthen our ties with our allies and expand trade with Africa, countries that really would like nothing more than the ability to have more access to our market and to do more business with us. So pursuing those types of agreements would not just be an economic policy, but it would create opportunities to expand good relations with countries that either are our allies now or could be closer allies in the future. And we're just not taking advantage of that opportunity, and it's very frustrating because let's face it, a lot of these countries would much rather do business with the United States than with China, and we're missing an opportunity there.
I definitely feel like we are as well. Now, the NTU and the free trade world, what are you looking at when it comes to the speaker race? We'll get back to Israel for a second because I've got another question. But when it comes to the speaker race, is that impacting the free trade opportunities as well?
You know, I think it affects really the perception people may have of the United States. Do we have a functioning government? Who's in charge? Those kinds of questions. But I think those are all going to get resolved sooner or later. I think it's important to have leadership that are going to tackle the real issues that are important to our future, things like the out-of-control deficit spending and government debt. And there's going to be some hiccups along the way. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but it will get resolved eventually. But before we can move forward in any real significant way, we need to get a speaker. We need to get a working, functioning House of Representatives. In many cases, though, our trade policy is driven by the executive branch, and that's why it's important to have an administration that's really looking out for what's best for all Americans. And so that's probably more important in the long term. But again, just in terms of the ability of other countries to recognize the U.S. as the important power that we are, we need to get some of this stuff squared away. But you know, I'm happy to see some members of Congress not just go along with business as usual, but to try and take an opportunity to enact, to elect people who are going to enact policies that are going to do what's right for the United States. Boy, it'd be nice to get somebody in place this week, though, so we could just move forward.
Washington must be pretty hectic. You know, I often feel like the NTU, Bryan Rally, is an extension of us, the taxpayer, because you're representing us, the taxpayer. So, with that being said, what initiatives is your division coming up with that maybe the Biden administration can listen to amidst all this chaos and turmoil, not only in Israel, but in Ukraine as well?
Well, we are the voice of America's taxpayers. We've been representing taxpayer interests for over 50 years. And I joined NTU when we were alerted to our concerns that U.S. leadership in international trade might be falling by the wayside, that we need not just the ability to be competitive here in the United States through open markets, but to encourage other countries to open their markets to U.S. goods and services as well. That really we've lost focus of all the opportunity there is in other markets for American businesses, whether it's high tech businesses, whether it's digital trade, whether it's agriculture. In many cases, we can compete with anybody in the world if the government will just work to bring trade barriers down. There are a couple of specific examples of U.S. policies. The generalized system of preferences is one that has expired, where we lower tariffs on goods from low-income countries with the idea we're better off giving them an opportunity to trade with us than we are to keep spending foreign aid dollars, trade not aid, so to speak. That helps those countries grow, helps them to be able to afford more U.S. products. And that's something where I think Republicans and Democrats, Congress and the Biden administration should be able to get on the same page. At least I sure hope so.
You know, it was great, and he was a guest frequently from the White House. Robert Lighthizer. Did you guys ever work with him while he was there in the as a representative?
We sure did, but he had a very different perspective than many of us who have worked on trade policy historically. So he served in the Reagan administration, but President Reagan very strongly believed that protectionism, in his words, protectionism is destructionism, and he worked to avoid trade wars that could risk U.S. prosperity. So Ambassador Lighthizer, he was more willing to put tariffs on things. That's exactly why President Trump appointed him to the position, because they were more skeptical about the benefits of trade. So I think in retrospect there are things that we could have done differently. I don't think we should have put tariffs on all of our allies, and we should have been more targeted in what we did with respect to China. But I don't want to bash somebody who's not there anymore. I really think it's more important to look at what the Biden administration is doing or failing to do, and hopefully the next administration, whoever it may be, will be able to do a better job.
All right, a big part of this, and Ryan and I have just been talking about this for a second, a big part of this is the fact that we let up $6 billion for a hostage swap. Not the best trade deal the Biden administration has done. Do you have any thoughts on that, or does the NTU have any thoughts on that?
Well, so the short answer is no, and that's just our focus is on tax issues and things that directly affect taxpayers. So clearly that's a lot of money, and we would be concerned about it from that perspective. We're hesitant to weigh into foreign policy issues, as important as they may be, unless they directly affect taxpayers. So if we're looking at, say, military spending or the next farm bill or things like that affect taxpayers, we would be more likely to weigh in. We are very, in general, cautious of government spending money on anything, though, at a time of record high deficits and exploding debt, and spending money without trying to cut enough spending elsewhere to bring those deficits in line. The amount of debt we have, given the fact that we're not involved in a war, that we're not involved in a recession or depression, it's really concerning with respect to the future of our country. So that's really where our priorities are focused.
Well, that is admirable. Now, would you consider you guys also sort of a lobbying arm, and that's a good lobbying in that you're trying to get these politicians to do the right things for taxpayers, right?
Well, when we were founded, part of the reason was everybody has their own representative group in Washington. I say everybody, maybe I'm exaggerating, but if you're a catfish farmer, there's a catfish farmer lobbying group. There's something for everybody, and that's we're a democracy, and it's great that people have ability to access Congress and to promote their views. But at the time we were founded, we thought there was a need for somebody to represent taxpayer views, because somebody's got to pay for all this stuff, right? And if nobody's representing taxpayers and everybody's got their hands out for this subsidy or this grant or this spending without considering the fact that somebody's got to pay for it, I think that puts us in a pretty tough spot. So we clearly have our work cut out for us. But yeah, NTU absolutely is both on the research side and on the advocacy side, every day fighting for the interests of taxpayers. And I'll be honest, a lot of times it's an uphill and sometimes a lonely fight, but it's something that I think most Americans would support and be glad that we're out here fighting for them. And our website, by the way, ntu.org, has a lot more information on the things that are important to us and the things that we do every day.
All right, I see you weighed in yesterday on this carbon talk. What's going on there? Because is the UA going back into the climate change world? What's going on there?
Well, there's discussions, negotiations have been going on between the United States and the European Union. The United States has wanted to impose restrictions on certain imports that they think are carbon intensive and bad for the environment. The European Union is pursuing its own path, which is different than what the Biden administration wants to do. So the Biden administration has been trying to get the European Union to agree to what we're doing. And the bottom line is it's all very complicated to me to get into all the weeds of this stuff. But it's just more taxes and more restrictions on imports, which, if something is unfairly subsidized, then that's something we need to take a look at. But it's really just an excuse, in my opinion, for the government to have more power over industries and pick winners and losers in a way that drives up prices, makes it harder for the U.S. to prosper and to create new jobs. The one concern that's out there is that the Biden administration or a future administration might abuse the Section 232 tariffs. And as you remember, those are the ones that we use to put tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Israel and other countries. A future president might say, hey, well, I want to restrict imports of whatever, you name it, because I think it's bad for the environment, or a bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with why that law is in the book, a Cold War era law, essentially giving presidents a blank check to intervene in the economy and restrict imports without a good reason. So one of the things that I think we would like to see happen is for Congress to be able to vote before similar taxes are imposed in the future. Congress needs to be able to vote. Do they agree that these policies would be in the U.S. interest or not? Right now, there's no check from Congress, so there's a possibility for a future administration, or the current one for that matter, to abuse these laws and run wild with this executive power.
All right, I know that executive power is something that I'm sure the NTU takes a look at how that's being used with regards to economics, and that leads me to my next question. Bidenomics is not a friend of free trade. That's what I've been hearing this whole conversation, right?
No, not at all. They're not as outspoken as the Trump administration was on some trade issues, but behind the scenes they've imposed a number of restrictions, regulations that drive up the cost of infrastructure projects. They're spending billions and billions of dollars on a variety of infrastructure, clean energy projects, and then laying on regulations that make those projects and clean energy and otherwise make them cost more than they should. That means one of two things: taxpayers have to pay more for them, or we don't get as much bang for the buck from the federal spending. They can't afford to do as much. There's things like Buy American requirements, which makes a lot of Americans, and I count myself one of them, hey, Buy American sounds good, but if somebody else, say in Canada, can provide a good or service more affordably, we ought to be able to take advantage of that. And at the same time, that allows us the opportunity to sell our goods and services to other countries. When we lock down the ability to use those affordable goods, if they're made in another country, those countries, in Canada as a specific example, have said, all right, well, we're not going to buy your products either. So it's really a lose-lose. It drives up the cost of projects and cuts us out from the ability to do business in other countries as well. And so that's the kind of thing the Biden administration has done, which drives up costs and leads to higher inflation, bouncing it to levels that many of us haven't seen in our lifetimes. And if that's Bidenomics, I think we need something else.
All right, I got to ask you a couple more questions. Abraham Accords, was that a trade deal that benefited Israel and the entire Middle East, or was that policy?
Those were more foreign policy accords as opposed to a particular trade agreement. So trade agreements are negotiated under specific rules laid down by Congress. They're voted on by Congress, approved on an up or down basis. We haven't had many trade deals recently, unfortunately, but so that's different than the route that treaties go through, or that something like the Abraham Accords would go through as well. So that would be a little bit outside of my area of expertise to weigh in on, I'm afraid.
That's okay. And then one last question. Do you monitor statements like Secretary Blinken, who said no taxpayer money has been used to fund Hamas? I mean, those kind of statements you want to believe, but is the NTU monitoring something like that, those kind of statements, when it does involve our tax dollars being mentioned by the Secretary of State?
We are absolutely strong advocates of transparency and holding officials accountable when they say things that are not accurate. We've done that with respect to trade policy. We've done it with respect to tax policy. Sometimes people will make statements like that, and maybe technically, if you're a lawyer from a legal perspective, they might be accurate, but big picture, the way the economy works and the way the world economy works, money has a way of getting where it's needed. So those are exactly the kinds of statements that we're paying attention to every day, whether it's with respect to, I say that, haven't looked specifically at that statement by Mr. Blinken, but I guarantee you we will. And anything like that, or other statements from the Biden administration that fly in the face of reality, we're going to try and let people know about that.
Free Trade Bryan, Bryan, I believe is where you can find him on Twitter. Bryan Riley. This has been great, and I feel like you're also monitoring, real quick, what's going on with the billions spent, to the Ukrainian efforts and the Israel. I mean, all these billions that are being sent out of America, that has a taxpayer hand on it too, doesn't it?
Well, again, somebody's got to pay for it, and there's certainly a case in the state in a situation where there's an emergency or something where there's national interest for us to take action. But we don't want to get. I don't think anybody wants to get in a rut where we just spend, and nobody is questioning the long-term costs, because the spending you're mentioning comes on top of all the money we spent during COVID and all the various bailouts, largely financed through deficit spending, which we're gonna have to pay, or our children, our grandchildren are going to have to pay. So yes, absolutely. I don't care what the spending is directed towards, but we absolutely need to make sure that we're spending it wisely and that we're accounting for the interests of the hardworking Americans who've got to pay for it.
Well, we'll get to more about. I want to get on another show with you and talk about your favorite president when it came to trade, because there's been a few you cite, but that's for another podcast, and would love to have you back here, Bryan, at another time.
Hey, I could do a whole podcast just talk about President Reagan, but I don't want to spoil it for you. So I would love that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and we'll definitely hold you to that next time on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network. That was Bryan Riley of the National Taxpayer Union's Free Trade Initiative.
Thank you.
Perfect, Bryan. Thank you so much.
Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Welcome back inside the Alex Garrett Podcast Network. It's been a busy weekend, as you probably saw on my Instagram, AlexGNYC1. Yes, we are announcing an engagement all weekend long, and it's been exciting. But my eye is not turned away from Israel, and I feel like, based on the moves behind the scenes from this Biden administration, they have turned their eye off Israel in the sense of, and maybe my next guest, Bryan Riley, the director of the National Taxpayer Union's Free Trade Initiative, can weigh in.